I'm Eun Jung-cho. North Korea conducted back-to-back weapons tests, firing multiple projectiles off its east coast. North Korea says it tested multiple launch rocket systems, but the U.S. and South Korean military believes the projectiles were short-range ballistic missiles. Today, we take a look at how powerful and evasive the new missiles are.
신형 대구경 조종 방사포 시험 사격을 지도하셨습니다.
Those are short-range missiles, sure. And a lot of other countries test that kind of missile also.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Ian Williams, Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Williams is also the Managing Editor of the CSIS website, Missile Threat, which carries analysis on missile proliferation and missile defense systems. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder has authored numerous books on Korean politics and foreign policy and Asian regionalism. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Scott, let me begin with you. So North Korea conducted 3 rounds of missile tests in only 8 days. What do you make of such rapid testing speed?
Well, I think the frequency of that testing shows that they're very focused on trying to test this new system in order to be able to incorporate it into its defense and security plans. Mm-hmm. And so this particular missile, it's very focused on reaching into South Korea in terms of depth, and also possibly being able to evade missile defense systems. And it also shows that North Korea is improving in terms of its ability to launch in a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. And Ian, North Korea says that the specific ones that it tested on July 31st were multiple launch rocket system, whereas South Korean military says that this is a short-range ballistic missile. So where is the gap? And is North Korea currently developing a crossover between the multiple launch rocket system and the SRBMs?
Mm-hmm. Well, the line between what is a ballistic missile and what is a sort of rocket artillery is very blurred, especially at these kind of lower ranges. So you could look at it from 2 perspectives. You could call this thing a very short-range ballistic missile, or a very short-range light ballistic missile, or you could call it a very long-ranged, very heavy rocket artillery. But in either case, it has the same effect. It can deliver a fairly lethal payload at quite some distance, and has a pretty significant, should have a pretty significant impact on how U.S. and South Korean military perceives threats to themselves.
Mm-hmm. So the type of missile that North Korea tested since May are identified as KN-23, the Iskander type of missile. So some people call this as a game changer on the Korean Peninsula. How threatening is this?
Well, there's 2 things that have alarmed me about this missile, and the first one of which is that it is solid-fueled, right? And this is a pretty significant leap for North Korea to have a functioning solid-fuel missile. And what a solid fuel does is that it allows you to launch a missile almost immediately upon deciding to do so. This is in big contrast to North Korea's other ballistic missiles, most of their other ballistic missiles, which are liquid-fueled. These things tend to take many hours to prepare. Another thing that would alarm me about the KN-23, if it does, it looks like it walks like an Iskander. If it in fact quacks like an Iskander too, it means it is considerably more accurate and precise than North Korea's other missiles. And what that means is that it can start more directly, more seriously threatening South Korean and U.S. military forces. You have to be fairly accurate to be able to hit things like air bases with effectiveness, troop formations with effectiveness. So that's another new development, I would say, strategically on the peninsula.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, many people also looked at the low altitude, the apogee. What is your take?
Well, I think that's about trying to find a way to be more evasive with missile defenses. And really the concern is that we've been so focused on the nuclear threat. The North Koreans are now trying to improve their conventional warfighting capabilities. And I think that that is significant because it actually shows that they feel vulnerable in this area. And they want to try to improve their capacity to be able to conduct conventional warfighting. And I'm increasingly looking at this round of testing really in some ways as a response to the kill chain, the massive punishment and retaliation strategy of South Korea. The North Koreans need to find a way to counter that in order to relieve their own sense of vulnerability. And I think that this testing of this type of missile is one element that they need to try to put into place in order to relieve their own sense of vulnerability and maintain their own sense of capacity to deter the perception of a risk of offensive attack from the U.S. and South Korea.
And Ian, this KN-23 has the range of 600 kilometers, which targets all of South Korea, and it can also mount nuclear weapons. So how soon, how quickly can the nuclear-mounted KN-23 reach a target within South Korea?
Well, if you assume that it has this roughly the speed of an Iskander, which is about 2 kilometers per second, it could, in theory, giving some time for acceleration, hit that 600-kilometer mark within 5 to 7 minutes. If it's closer, if they're not firing as far, it could go even shorter, even less time.
And is KN-23 not a threat to Japan at all?
It is a little too short range from what we've seen to be a threat to Japan.
And Scott, North Korea tested missiles in different ranges from 250 kilometers to 600 kilometers. Do you think there's a reason in that? And is North Korea targeting specific locations?
Well, they want to show that they have a range. And there's also issues related to payload. We don't know necessarily what those were carrying. But I think the main idea is to try to demonstrate a capacity to shoot at different ranges and trajectories as a means by which to demonstrate a capacity to challenge missile defense systems. Because the more capacity that North Korea has to do that, the more variety of needs that the U.S. and South Korea would need to have in place in terms of being able to defend against the types of attacks that North Korea could launch.
And Ian, Chairman Kim also went to the testing of a submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And how much of a threat is this to the United States and South Korea?
I still see it as a latent threat, a potential threat. They have put a submarine to sea, an older submarine to sea, not the one that we recently saw in the photographs. I always questioned that sub's ability to actually be equipped and fire one of their supposed sub-launched missiles. I think they have some ways to go in terms of getting a ballistic missile submarine that's both seaworthy and quiet enough to be really a threat. And we've also, seen, we did see several years ago them testing a sub-launched missile. We saw them firing it from undersea platforms. Ultimately, they took that missile and moved it on land as part of a ground-based system. So that, to me, that indicated to them that they had a kind of a working missile, but not a working sub. So what can we do with this missile? Let's put it on a truck. And I think that to me was a sign that they're not quite so confident in their submarine capability.
But also I think that we can say that the submarine program is an indication of intent to develop a nuclear strike from a different platform. And so I do think that as we think about North Korea's nuclear development in the long term, this is an area that the North Koreans have put up a marker that we have to watch.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Oftentimes North Korea will unveil capabilities and even boast about capabilities long before they're operational, and sometimes we dismiss them at the time, but then several years later they'll start, they show up in working fashions.
And on that point of boasting, Chairman Kim turned to the new tactical weapons development after the breakdown of the Hanoi summit. So what do you think of the timing?
Well, in part post-Hanoi, I think initially the North Koreans were trying to recover from the sense of failure post-Hanoi. And also, I think that it's increasingly clear that they had a space where they had a technical need, and there was not a restraint politically in terms of being able to pursue that. And I think that President Trump has continued to be very permissive in terms of not imposing any kind of limit in terms of expectation with regards to North Korea doing a short-range ballistic missile test. And so, as a result, we still don't see that limit. I think that it's possible that these tests could continue for some time.
And when we think of how we can counter this North Korean threat, are there ways that we can effectively intercept this very evasive North Korean KN-23 with the current system that is on the South Korean peninsula, the PAC-2, PAC-3s, and the THAAD?
Well, I definitely think that the Patriot missile defense system, in terms of what we have deployed now, is probably the most capable against this specific threat. It does fly quite low. I don't want to say it's too low for THAAD to intercept, but it is definitely on the lower end of what I think THAAD can intercept. And I think THAAD would also be challenged from the sensor perspective. The TP-2 is kind of, the TP-2 radar, which the THAAD operates from, is looking for generally higher projectiles, higher flying projectiles, and also because of the curve of the Earth, the lower altitude a threat gets, the harder it is to see at any kind of range, just because of the nature of how the Earth is shaped, right? So in that sense, you're not going to be able to, it'll be more challenging to see this missile coming until it's much closer to you. And that's more of a kind of a situation, that end game terminal situation as the missile's re-entering the atmosphere, that Patriot really excels at, is that terminal phase missile defense. But the problem with a Patriot is that it can't defend much territory. It's very much what we call a point defense system. So if you want it to defend an air base, it has to be on the air base. If you want it to defend the downtown area of a city, it needs to be in the downtown area of a city.
And Scott, is South Korea currently well equipped to counter against the North Korean missile threat? And what is current South Korean position in joining the U.S.-led missile defense system?
Well, I think that South Korea has a lot of capabilities. It can always be improved. North Korea is challenging a new dimension of capability for defense. The South Korean missile defense system is really, as they put it, the Korean air and missile defense system. It's separate from the U.S. system regionally. And the issue of integration has been out there as a topic of discussion. In a way, I think the South Koreans have backed themselves up against the wall because one of the three no's that was named in President Moon's early negotiations with China was no expansion of THAAD, and then another one was related to a commitment not to regionalize missile defense, not to join the U.S. missile defense network.
And just to follow up with that, I think that at the time, I think that was almost an easy concession to make. Not many people thought about it. It was kind of a throwaway concession. But I think that has, with this kind of threat, which is, blurs the line between a ballistic missile and an air defense threat, it's a much more complicated, lower flying missile threat than we've seen before. The inability or the decision not to integrate with the United States makes it much more challenging to defend. When you have a lower flying missile, it's much better to be able to see this thing with multiple radars, multiple systems, right? Because no one system is going to be able to see it for very long. But in order for that to work, you have to be able to integrate. And there's lots of capabilities that the U.S. can bring to help South Korea better track and detect these things. Aerial sensors, with things like the F-35, and other sea-based radars. There's a lot of capabilities that, when tied together, could provide a pretty effective defense against this kind of missile. But when everything is separated and standing alone and operating in a vacuum, it becomes much more challenging.
So it'll be really interesting to see whether this round of tests in North Korea actually opens the next chapter of the missile defense debate in the South Korean security community. And it would probably revolve around the issue of integration with the United States.
And before we move on, Scott, China, in its latest defense white paper, again mentioned the deployment of THAAD and that it has aggravated the regional balance. So what is Chinese current intention? Is it to drive a wedge between U.S. and South Korea?
Well, China has continued to mention THAAD as a sticking point in the South Korea-China relationship. I think that the Chinese are laying down a marker with regards to defense systems of the U.S. deployed in South Korea that could potentially have regional application. The Chinese, from a political perspective, want the U.S.-Korea alliance to remain focused solely on North Korea. That's the message they're trying to send. But increasingly, we're in a world where it's a very hard line to try to draw. And it puts a lot of pressure on South Korean defense planners because they actually are gaining regional capabilities that can be applied regionally. And also, the North Koreans are challenging in ways that require South Korea to take steps that may bring it over that line.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to leave our conversation here and now watch a video for our next discussion.
And we are looking forward to the chance to reconnect with them in a formal way diplomatically.
希望美朝双方能够相向而行，照顾彼此的合理的关系。
Secretary Pompeo and Special Representative Began visited Bangkok, Thailand to attend the ASEAN Regional Forum. North Korea's foreign minister is not attending this meeting for the first time in 10 years. Now, Scott, there were wide expectations that the U.S. and North Korea would meet at this venue. So is Secretary Pompeo stood up by Foreign Minister Ri?
I would say yes and no, because the purpose of the ASEAN Regional Forum is about regional security. We expect the Secretary of State to go. But the urgent priority in the region is related to the U.S.-North Korea negotiations. And the North Koreans, Foreign Minister Lee Young-ho, knew that Pompeo was going to be there and decided not to go. And so in that sense, yes, he was stood up.
Mm-hmm. And Special Representative Began was there, and he met with chief nuclear negotiators from South Korea and Japan. And considering the current tension between the two countries, and considering the fact that North Korea's top foreign minister is not there, do you think there would have been any tangible progress in that meeting?
Just backstopping in terms of coordination. And I do believe that there is work that can be done specifically focused on North Korea. That should go on despite whatever's happening in South Korea-Japan relations. And so in that respect, to maintain coordination that includes South Korea and Japan is actually important to U.S. broader national security objectives in the region.
Mm-hmm. And Ian, China in this meeting said that it would like to create an environment to help North Korea and the United States meet. So at this point, what can China do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the big barriers there's a bit of a credibility gap, I think, particularly of the Trump administration with China, and it's a bit of a distrust as to whether or not China can be really a neutral broker in all of this. There is some even that think that China is sort of secretly supporting North Korea in their weapons development and is sort of playing both sides. So I think China, I think, needs to demonstrate that it is more of a neutral arbiter, that it has an interest in North Korean disarmament before it can be, like I said, a credible interlocutor between North Korea and the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, what do you make of the recent meeting at the DMZ between the top NSC official and his North Korean counterpart? He was there to deliver a memento from President Trump and Chairman Kim's meeting at the DMZ. So what do you think of this meeting? Would this help the two sides resume the working level talks?
Well, any kind of direct meeting among working level officials between the U.S. and North Korea should be positive for understanding the barriers to getting back to senior level talks on denuclearization. We really don't know how much might have been going on under the surface around that meeting. And we also have to wait and see whether the expectations that Secretary Pompeo has continued to voice about an early resumption of talks will finally be realized.
Mm-hmm. And Ian, do you think North Korea also has intentions to come back to the talks? And considering the latest missile testings, it was the rhetoric and the range were targeted against South Korea.
Yeah.
What is your take?
My take is that they are mostly interested in having more of a bilateral dialogue with the United States. And in some ways trying to divide the Trump administration from South Korea and have a stronger relationship between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And I think the Trump administration is, and particularly the president himself, is playing into that. Dismissing these missile launches as being, standard missiles, and that these are nothing to be concerned about. And a lot of countries, engage in these kinds of weapons tests. And while that's true, and that may work, that may play to a domestic audience to kind of allay, U.S. concerns about these tests, but it's very little comfort to South Korea. So I think North Korea, by testing shorter range missiles, and they haven't we haven't seen any of their ICBMs or them boasting about any intercontinental missiles. I think they're trying to have be able to work on developing these local these regional systems, while also giving the Trump administration an easy out to continue talks and continue the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, Secretary Pompeo is optimistic that the talks with North Korea will resume soon. And also the North Korean counterpart met with the NSC official and said that the talks will resume soon. But when do you think the talks will resume? Would it come right now or after the end of the joint military drill?
Well, it appears more likely that the talks will resume after the end of the joint military drill. But I think increasingly what we have to be worried about is, even if the two sides meet, can they make progress? Because these kinds of tests and the rigidity of the North Korean statements since the meeting at Panmunjom suggests that even if they meet, it's going to be very hard to make progress. And frankly, increasingly here in Washington, there's a growing trust gap in terms of perceptions of North Korean credibility with regards to its pledges to pursue complete denuclearization.
Well, we'll leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today is Chairman Kim Jong-un supervising test firing of the new multiple launch rocket system on July 31st. In this picture, Chairman Kim and his officials observes test launches inside what looks like a small bus or a large van. Scott, what's your take?
Well, there has been speculation about the new van and whether it's a violation of the luxury goods ban on imports into North Korea. We don't know very much about the van, but it looks like it's got a good TV system. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Kim Jong-un looks much too comfortable right there.
Mm-hmm. Ian, is this something common in other countries?
Well, you do see mobile command and control. From a military perspective, I would be looking at this and saying, is this a viable mobile operational command and control center? In which case, that would be something, because one of the big plans, to be able to preempt North Korean missile strikes is to be able to target command and control centers, to be able to sever those giving the orders to launch from the launchers themselves. So if this is some movement towards creating an unfixed mobile, perhaps more easily camouflaged command and control site, that could be an interesting development that would make the North Korean missile forces a lot more resilient to a preemptive strike. So, but that's very speculation. Otherwise, it looks like a very nice RV, maybe a Winnebago.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ian, Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.